1.5 million Cuban Americans living in Florida right now. Why would they vote for you when they hear you praise a program of Fidel Castro, a dictator who jailed, tortured, and killed thousands of Cubans?
I have opposed authoritarianism, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, whether it's in China, or whether it is in Russia. That is my life record. I believe, unlike the President of the United States, in democracy, not authoritarianism in Cuba or any place else. What I believe right now in this world is that we are faced with a global crisis and a movement toward authoritarianism. That's what Putin in Russia is leading. That's what MBS in Saudi Arabia is leading. And as President of the United States, unlike Donald Trump, I would put the flag down and say that in this country and in this world, we have got to move toward democracy and human rights. That is my view and has always been my view.
To be clear, Senator Sanders, Cuba has been a dictatorship for decades. Shouldn't we judge dictators by the violation of human rights and not by any of their alleged achievements?
Well, I think you can make the same point about China. China is undoubtedly an authoritarian society, okay? But would anybody deny, any economists deny, that extreme poverty in China today is much less than what it was 40 or 50 years ago? That's a fact. So I think we condemn authoritarianism, whether it's in China, Russia, Cuba, any place else. But to simply say that nothing ever done by any of those administrations had a positive impact on their people would, I think, be incorrect.
Vice President Biden, you have criticized Senator Sanders for praising Castro's education system. But in 2016, President Obama said Cuba made, quote, a great progress in educating young people and that its healthcare system is a huge achievement that they should be congratulated for. How is that different from what Senator Sanders has said?
He was trying to change Cuban policy so the Cuban people would get out from under the thumb of the Castro and his brother. That is to change the policy so that we could impact on Cuba's policy by getting them opened up. That was about. But the praising of the Sandinistas, the praising of Cuba, the praising just now of China. China is an authoritarian dictatorship. That's what it is. We have to deal with them because they're there. But the idea that they, in fact, have increased the wealth of people in that country, it's been marginal, the change that has taken place. It is still, they have 1 million Uyghurs, 1 million Muslims in prison camps in the West. You see what's happening in Hong Kong today. And by the way, the idea that he praised the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union about the things that they had done well. They're an awful dictatorship killing millions and millions of people. And in addition to that, we have a circumstance where after the election was all over and we knew what was done by the Russians now in interfering with our elections, this man voted against sanctioning Russia for interference in our elections. I don't get it.
Well, what you don't get, and this is exactly what the problem with politics is about. All right, question. Did China make progress in ending extreme poverty over the last 50 years? Yes or no?
That's like saying Jack the Ripper.
No, it's not.
Right. Yes, it
Joe,
is.
this is the problem.
Yes, it is.
This is the problem. We can't talk. I know there's a political line. I understand. China's terrible, awful, nothing ever good. Russia, blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is, China, of course, is an authoritarian society. That's what I just said.
It's a dictatorship.
That's what I just said 5 minutes ago, you know. And by the way, you know, the question that was asked, quoted Barack Obama. President Obama was more generous in his praise of what Cuba did in healthcare and education than I was. I was talking about a program 60 years ago in the first year of the Castro revolution. So the bottom line is that I think it's a little bit absurd if we're going to look at the world the way it is. Of course, we are opposed to authoritarian. And by the way, you know, before it was considered good policy, good idea, I was condemning the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia when a lot of other people in Washington, I was condemning the dictatorship in the UAE. You were not.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Vice President Biden.
Look, the idea of occasionally saying something nice about a country is one thing. The idea of praising a country that is violating human rights around the world is, in fact, makes our allies wonder what's going on. What do you think the South Koreans think when he praises China like that? What do you think the Australians believe in the shadow of China? What do you think is happening in Indonesia in the shadow of China? What do you think is happening in terms of Japan in the shadow of China? Words matter. These are flat-out dictators, period. And they should be called for it, straight up. We may have to work out, for example, I was able to help negotiate a new START agreement with Russia. Not because I like Putin. The guy's a thug.
Mr. Vice President, sticking with foreign policy, you acknowledge that your support and vote for the Iraq War was a mistake. What lessons did you learn from that mistake, and how might those lessons influence your foreign policy decision-making as president?
I learned I can't take the word of a president when, in fact, they assured me that he would not use force. Remember the context. The context was the United Nations Security Council was going to vote to insist that we allow inspectors in to determine whether or not they were, in fact, producing producing nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. They were not. And what's the first thing that happened when we got elected? The President Obama turned to me and said, get those troops out of there. I was responsible for getting 150,000 combat troops out of Iraq. I admitted 14 years ago was a mistake to have trusted him. And I'm prepared to compare my foreign policy credentials up against my friend here on any day of the week and every day of the week.
Let's start off with the war in Iraq, Joe. I was there too. I was in the House. I understood. And by the way, let's be clear about what that vote was. And you were there at the signing ceremony with Bush. Everybody in the world knew that when you voted for that resolution, you were giving Bush the authority to go to war. And everybody knew that's exactly what he and Cheney wanted to do. Most people who followed that issue closely understood that the Bush administration was lying through its teeth with regard to Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. I understood that. I was on the floor of the House time and time again. But the issue is not just the war in Iraq. That was a long time ago. The issue is the trade agreement. It wasn't so easy for me to lead the effort against disastrous trade agreements. The issue was the bankruptcy bill that you supported. The issue was the Hyde Amendment. The issue is the Defense of Marriage Act. The issue is whether or not in difficult times, and God knows these are difficult times, we're going to have the courage to take on powerful special interests and do what's right for the working families of this country.
Why did you vote not to sanction the Russians?
You know why? Because that had everything. You keep talking about Iran. That was tied to Iran. Russia was in Iran. I think John Kerry indicated his support for what I did. That was undermining the Iranian agreement. That's why.
Not true.
That's why. And that's the only reason why. I have condemned Russia time and time again.
Vice President Biden.
The fact is that the idea that I, in fact, supported the things that he's suggesting is not accurate. Look, I'm the guy that helped put together the Iran deal and got the inspectors in there. That was my chief of staff was the guy, my foreign policy guy, doing that negotiation. I was the guy that helped put together a 60-nation organization to take on the ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. I've dealt with these folks. I know them, and I know what they're like, and I know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. The fact is, this Bernie's notion about how he embraces folks like the Sandinistas and Cuba and the former Soviet Union and talks about the good things they did in China is absolutely contrary to every message we want to send the rest of the world.
Senator Sanders?
I have led the effort against all forms of authoritarianism, including America's so-called allies in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, as you may know, worked with conservative Republicans to utilize for the very first time the War Powers Act to get the United States out of the horrific war in Yemen led by Saudi Arabia. That's what I did. So my view is that in a world moving toward authoritarianism, the United States has got to be the leader where people all over the world look to us.
Thank you, Senator.
For guidance.
Gentlemen, I want to change